Will Smith had always been known for his charismatic presence, whether on or off the screen. One evening, he entered a luxurious hotel lobby in downtown Los Angeles, just like any other regular day. He had just finished a meeting, and he was looking forward to some quiet time away from the hectic schedules. The hotel, with its sleek decor and soft lighting, offered the perfect retreat. Little did Will know, this visit would soon take a turn that no one could have predicted. As he approached the reception desk, a sudden noise interrupted the calm atmosphere. A man in his mid-30s, dressed in a sharp suit, was standing near the entrance, visibly struggling. He appeared to be gasping for breath, his hand clutching his chest as if in pain. Will immediately noticed the distress on the man's face, and a sense of unease washed over him. The man's body language screamed that something was terribly wrong. Will's instincts kicked in. His years of experience in high-pressure situations, both on set and in his personal life, had prepared him for moments like these. He knew it was serious when the man suddenly collapsed onto the floor, his eyes wide open, but unable to speak. The scene was unfolding fast, and Will's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. Was this a heart attack? Or was there something more? The room had grown tense as guests around him froze, unsure of what to do. In that split second, Will's mind cleared, focusing on one single goal: to save the man's life. Time felt like it was stretching out endlessly. Everyone around him seemed paralyzed by shock. Will knew he had no choice but to act fast, and his every move now mattered. As he knelt beside the man, his quick thinking began to unfold. It was a race against time, and the world around them had paused. What would happen next would keep everyone riveted, waiting for the unbelievable to happen. As Will Smith bent down to assess the man's condition, his heart raced. He could feel the urgency in the air, the weight of the situation pressing on him. His mind flashed back to his training for roles in action films, where he had learned some basic first aid techniques. But this was real life, not a movie. Every second counted. The man's lips were turning blue, his chest barely rising as he struggled to breathe. Will immediately shouted for someone to call 911, but there was no time to waste. He couldn't wait for help to arrive. He had to act now. Without a moment's hesitation, Will gently placed his hands on the man's chest, preparing to administer CPR. His mind worked in overdrive, pushing aside the panic that was threatening to take hold. He focused on the man's heartbeat, praying that it wasn't too late. The lobby had grown eerily silent, with everyone frozen, watching in stunned disbelief. The hotel staff and guests were watching him, many unsure of what to do, while Will remained calm, steady, and determined. As he began chest compressions, Will's focus intensified. Each pump was a calculated move, pushing harder, faster, trying to revive the man who was teetering on the edge of life and death. He glanced up briefly to see if anyone was coming to help, but the seconds felt like hours. Will didn't allow the rising fear to take over. Instead, he pushed through it, remembering his training, and more importantly, trusting his instincts. There was no room for hesitation in moments like this. The hotel lobby, once a serene space of elegance, had now become a chaotic arena. Will's adrenaline surged as he continued his life-saving efforts, with the pressure mounting. The man's body was unresponsive, but Will kept going, his determination never wavering. Everyone around him seemed riveted, drawn to his every move, as if hoping that his actions would somehow defy the odds. Little did they know, what would come next would push the limits of what they thought possible. Would this be enough? Would Will be able to save a life in a way no one could have predicted? As Will continued to perform CPR, the tension in the hotel lobby grew palpable. The man's chest, once still, began to rise slightly with each compression, a flicker of hope in an otherwise dire situation. Will's focus never wavered, his movements precise, driven by the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The crowd around him, once silent, now murmured nervously. Some guests were whispering to each other. Some had pulled out their phones to record, while others stood frozen in place, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Will knew the pressure was on, not just for him but for everyone watching. There was no room for error. Suddenly, just as Will thought he might be making progress, the man's body lurched violently. It was as though a wave of energy had surged through him, his limbs jerking in an involuntary spasm. Will immediately stopped, his eyes wide in concern, unsure of what was happening. The man's face contorted in pain, and his breathing, which had momentarily steadied, now became more erratic. It was as if the situation had escalated beyond anything Will had prepared for. The struggle was far from over, and the fear in the air was thick. The hotel lobby, once a peaceful retreat, now resembled a scene from a thriller, the chaos escalating rapidly. One of the hotel employees had rushed to the front desk, shouting for someone to call emergency services again, though they were already on their way. But even that didn't seem to matter as much now. Will felt his resolve hardening. He was in this moment, in this life-or-death struggle, for the long haul. The man was gasping harder, his chest heaving with desperation. His body was fighting against the inevitable, but Will refused to let him slip away. He had no choice but to press on. A few more seconds passed, and then the man's body seized up again, even more violently this time. Will's heart sank as he quickly shifted his technique, trying different angles, applying more force, all while his own body trembled with exhaustion. The room was filled with tension, as if time itself had stopped. The crowd was now fully engaged, unable to look away from the unfolding scene. Some guests had begun pacing, others had covered their mouths in shock. But in that moment, Will had no time to think about them. His sole focus was the man lying in front of him, fighting for his life, while everyone around him was captivated by his every move, hoping for a miracle. Just as the struggle seemed to reach its peak, an unexpected twist unfolded that no one could have prepared for. Will's hands were still firmly on the man's chest, pushing down with all his strength, when suddenly, the man's eyes shot open. A gasp escaped his lips, sharp and ragged, as if he had been awakened from a deep sleep. The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone who had been watching, their breaths held in anticipation, froze in disbelief. For a brief moment, it felt as though the whole world had stopped, the only sound being the desperate gasps of the man now wide-eyed and clearly alive. But there was more. As Will pulled back, still shaken from the moment of relief, the man's lips trembled, and he began to speak in a low, strained voice. I was never supposed to die," he mumbled, his words slurring as if he was trying to make sense of the confusion swirling around him. Will, still in a daze from the sudden turn of events, leaned in, his ear close to the man's lips, trying to understand what was happening. Was this some sort of delirium? Or had the man been conscious all along? The words he spoke were chilling, leaving Will momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, the man's body suddenly stiffened again, but this time, it wasn't from a seizure or another spasm. His eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room as if searching for something, or someone. His voice, now clearer but filled with panic, broke the silence. They're coming for me! You don't understand! I was supposed to die!" he screamed, his voice growing louder with every word. The lobby, once a space filled with whispers of concern, now buzzed with nervous energy. Guests who had been standing idly by began backing away, unsure of what to make of the situation. Will felt a chill run down his spine. The scene had taken an even more bizarre turn. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. The man was terrified, almost as if he had been expecting death and was now desperately trying to avoid something or someone. Will's mind raced. What had this man been involved in? What had he seen? And why had he been so certain of his fate? Will's instincts told him that this was no coincidence, that something far darker was at play, and it left everyone in the room riveted, unable to tear their eyes away from the unfolding spectacle. The tension in the air was suffocating, and everyone could feel it. This was no ordinary rescue. As the man's panicked words echoed through the room, Will Smith's mind raced, but his focus never wavered. The strange shift in the man's behavior was enough to send a ripple of unease through the lobby. Will had saved lives before, on film that is, but this was real, and the stakes were much higher. His instincts screamed at him to protect this man, but the words he had just heard were gnawing at him. "They're coming for me." What did that mean? Who were they? Will's gaze darted around the hotel lobby, scanning the faces of the bystanders, looking for any hint of danger, any sign that would explain the man's frantic behavior. But there was nothing. Nothing except the rising tension that clung to the air. Without hesitation, Will made a decision that would alter the course of this bizarre situation. He grabbed the man gently by the shoulders, shaking him slightly to snap him out of his panic. "Hey, focus on me. You're alive. You've got another shot at this," he said firmly, trying to steady the man's shaking body. The man's eyes widened as if he were seeing Will for the first time. But the terror hadn't left his face. It was still there, buried beneath layers of confusion. Will knew he had to get answers, and fast. "You need to calm down," Will urged, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Tell me what's really going on. Who's coming for you?" But before the man could respond, there was a sudden sound, a faint clicking noise, as if something mechanical had been activated. Will's head snapped toward the door. His heart skipped a beat. Was this the "they" the man had been talking about? His instincts screamed at him to act. Will knew that waiting for answers could be dangerous. Whoever or whatever was coming needed to be stopped before it was too late. Making a split-second decision, Will stood up and helped the man to his feet, supporting him as best as he could. The lobby, now alive with whispers and tension, was no longer a place of luxury and relaxation. It had become a battleground, with Will caught in the middle of something far beyond his comprehension. But he wasn't going to let this man, who had somehow been saved by his hands, fall victim to whatever threat lay on the horizon. Will made the brave choice to protect him, leading him away from the center of the lobby toward a more secluded area. His mind was racing. If there was danger lurking, he needed to keep this man safe, no matter what it took. With every step, the fear in the room grew thicker. Guests were beginning to realize that something was amiss, some edging toward the exits, others staring wide-eyed at Will and the man who had narrowly escaped death. But Will didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. In that moment, everything seemed to hinge on what would happen next. The audience, now entranced by the situation unfolding before them, held their breath. What could possibly come next? And was Will Smith's decision to protect this man going to be enough to survive the oncoming threat? As Will and the man quickly moved toward the back of the hotel lobby, the tension was almost unbearable. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder, closer. Will's instincts told him that time was running out. The man, still shaking and wide-eyed with fear, whispered, "They're coming. You don't know who they are, but you'll regret it if they catch us." Will wasn't sure who they were, but the urgency in the man's voice left him no choice but to act swiftly. His eyes darted to the entrance where he could see shadowy figures moving in the distance. His pulse quickened. With every step, the world seemed to close in around them. Will's mind worked rapidly to formulate a plan. He couldn't risk staying in the open any longer. The lobby had turned into a tense game of cat and mouse, and Will was determined to get both himself and the man to safety. As they reached a hallway, Will pushed open a door to an emergency stairwell and motioned for the man to follow. There was no time to explain, no time to ask questions. Will's only priority now was survival. In the stairwell, as the door slammed behind them, Will paused for a moment to catch his breath. His thoughts raced. What had he just gotten involved in? The man's cryptic words, his desperate struggle to survive. It all felt like a scene from a thriller, but it was real. Will, still gripping the man's arm, glanced at him and demanded, "Who's coming for you? What's going on?" The man, now visibly exhausted, looked at Will with a strange mix of gratitude and fear. "I don't know how you saved me, but they'll never stop looking for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps pounding up the stairs reached their ears. Will's heart skipped a beat. They were getting closer. Will knew they couldn't stay here any longer. His mind raced for a solution, but there was no time. He had to act. Without warning, Will made a split-second decision. He turned and ran down the stairwell, the man stumbling behind him. Every moment felt like it could be their last. The sound of pursuers grew fainter as they reached the bottom floor, but Will didn't stop. He knew the danger wasn't over yet. He had saved the man's life once, but that wasn't enough. He had to make sure they both made it out alive. As they finally reached a back exit, Will pushed open the door and pulled the man outside into the cool night air. For a moment, it felt as though they had escaped, as though they had outrun the unknown threat. But Will knew that the chase was far from over. The man's life had been spared, but Will's quick thinking had only just begun. There were still unanswered questions, still dark shadows lurking around every corner. But one thing was certain. Will Smith had acted swiftly, saved a life, and now had no choice but to keep running, with no guarantee of safety. As the two of them disappeared into the night, the hotel behind them remained in an eerie silence. No one inside knew the full extent of what had happened. No one would ever understand the twists, the danger, and the shock that had unfolded in those critical moments. The man's life had been saved, but Will's decision to protect him had set a chain of events into motion, events that no one could predict.